Ranger began growling at the cellar doors before Ethan Carter had even found the key to the farmhouse. It was not the sharp warning growl Ethan remembered from patrols overseas. It was lower than that, almost uncertain, as if the old German shepherd had caught the scent of someone who had been waiting underground for years. His gray muzzle hovered inches above the warped boards. His ears stood rigid. Then he looked back at Ethan and struck the door once with his paw. Something answered from below. A soft wooden knock. Ethan froze in the knee-high grass, one hand still wrapped around the eviction notice in his jacket pocket. He had come to the abandoned farm because he had nowhere else to go. He had not come looking for a mystery. He had certainly not expected the only living soul he trusted to lead him toward a sealed room beneath his grandmother's house. Before we continue, tell us what city or state you are watching from. And if you believe loyalty can guide people home when they have lost their way, share your thoughts and subscribe for more stories of courage, compassion, and extraordinary K9s. The knock did not come again. Ranger waited, his weight balanced over his front legs, watching the doors with the patient focus that had once made him one of the most dependable search dogs in Ethan's army unit. He was 12 now. His right hip stiffened in cold weather, and silver had spread across his face, but he had not forgotten how to tell Ethan when something mattered. Tomorrow, Ethan said, though his voice sounded less certain than he intended. We get through tonight first. Ranger did not move until Ethan touched his collar. Only then did he turn away, glancing back twice as they crossed the yard. The farmhouse stood deep in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, at the end of a gravel road nearly swallowed by weeds. Once, its white siding had shone against the green mountains. Now the paint had weathered to gray. One porch rail sagged. Ivy climbed the stone chimney, and fallen branches lay across the front steps like a warning left by the last storm. To Ethan, it looked less like an inheritance than one more thing he had failed to protect. 3 hours earlier, he had handed over the keys to his apartment in Roanoke. The landlord had been kind enough not to watch while Ethan loaded his last duffel bag, his father's rusted toolbox, and a folded army blanket into the bed of his old pickup. Kindness had made the humiliation worse. Ethan had served 9 years. He had led men through dust storms, winter patrols, and nights when nobody spoke above a whisper. Yet after a warehouse injury, a layoff, and 6 months of missed opportunities, he could not keep a one-bedroom apartment. He had ignored calls from former teammates. He had stopped opening messages. Pride had become a locked door, and he had been standing behind it alone. Ranger was the only one he had let stay. The German shepherd had been retired into Ethan's care after a blast damaged the dog's hearing in one ear and left Ethan with a scar beneath his ribs that tightened whenever he remembered too much. Ranger had found him in smoke when no one else could see him. Years later, when nightmares pulled Ethan out of bed, Ranger still crossed the room and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's knee until the walls felt solid again. Now the dog followed him onto the porch of a house filled with another kind of silence. The front key stuck twice before the lock gave way. Cold air drifted from the hallway, carrying cedar, dust, and the faint lavender polish Ethan's grandmother had used on every piece of furniture she owned. He stood in the doorway with his bag hanging from one hand. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The umbrella stand still held her red walking cane. Lace curtains softened the late afternoon light. A chipped ceramic bowl waited on the entry table for keys that would never be dropped there again. On the wall hung a framed needlepoint message Ethan had laughed at as a boy. Home will always be waiting for you. His grandmother, Eleanor Carter, had written the same words in every letter she sent him. During deployments, Ethan had treated them as comfort. After her death 2 years earlier, they had felt like an accusation. She had asked him to visit. He had promised he would. He kept finding reasons to postpone the drive until there was no one left to welcome him. Ranger moved through the room slowly, nose low, gathering the history Ethan had tried not to remember. In the kitchen, the dog stopped beneath the table where Eleanor used to slip him pieces of roast chicken. His tail moved once. Ethan looked away. He spent the remaining daylight opening windows, checking pipes, and dragging a mattress from an upstairs bedroom into the living room because the stairs groaned beneath Ranger's weight. The power worked in only half the house. The well pump coughed rust-colored water before running clear. There was canned soup in his truck, a flashlight, and enough gasoline for one more trip into town. It was not much, but it was shelter. Near sunset, he found a photograph behind a row of cookbooks. Eleanor stood beneath an oak tree beside 3 veterans in faded dress uniforms. A younger ranger sat at her feet, alert and proud. Behind them stood an older white man in suspenders, one hand resting on the head of another German shepherd. On the back, Eleanor had written, Memorial Day, 1998. Samuel said every story deserves a safe place. Ethan read the sentence twice. He did not know anyone named Samuel. A floorboard creaked outside the kitchen. Ranger was gone. Ethan found him back in the yard, sitting beside the cellar doors as darkness gathered over the mountains. The dog's nose touched the lower seam. This time there was no knock, only a faint current of air stirring dead leaves near the threshold. Ethan crouched and pulled away the vines. Beneath them, someone had recently scratched 3 marks into the wood. Not recently, he realized after brushing away the dirt. The lines were old, carved deep and protected by the growth around them. An oak tree, a 5-pointed star, and the initials S.W. Ranger looked up at him. Ethan had spent months believing his life had narrowed to an unpaid balance, an empty apartment, and a truck that might not survive winter. But as he touched the carved initials, he felt something unfamiliar move beneath the shame. Curiosity. For the first time in a long while, tomorrow did not feel like a threat. At dawn, Ranger was already waiting by the back door. Mist lay over the orchard, turning the rows of neglected apple trees into pale shadows. Ethan made coffee in Eleanor's dented stovetop pot, drank it black, and tried to convince himself that the sound beneath the cellar doors had been a branch shifting somewhere inside the foundation. Ranger watched him from the kitchen. You are not letting this go. The dog blinked once. Ethan found a pry bar in his father's toolbox and crossed the wet grass. The iron handles were buried beneath years of leaves. Rust flaked into his palms as he pulled. At first the doors refused to move. Ranger stepped beside him and pushed his nose against the edge. Ethan shifted his grip, planted both boots, and pulled again. The doors opened with a long groan. Cold air rose from the darkness, dry and clean, carrying cedar instead of mold. Wooden steps descended beneath the house. A single bulb hung from a wire overhead. Ethan pressed the switch beside the frame, expecting nothing. The bulb flickered to life. That is impossible. Ranger went down before him. The basement was larger than Ethan remembered. Shelves of mason jars lined one wall. Furniture rested beneath white sheets. Split firewood had been stacked with military precision beside an iron furnace. Nothing explained the knocking sound. Ranger crossed the room and stopped in front of a stone wall hidden behind a shelving unit. Ethan's shoulders tightened. The dog had worn that same posture before locating a concealed tunnel during training. No frantic movement. No wasted energy. Only a fixed stare and a body prepared to act. Ethan removed jars from the shelves one by one. Peaches, green beans, apple butter dated nearly 15 years earlier. When the unit was empty, he pulled it away from the wall. Its feet scraped across the floor, revealing a section of stone with mortar smoother than the rest. The carved oak tree appeared first, then the star, then S.W. Ranger pressed his nose to the lower corner and pawed once. A piece of mortar broke loose. Behind it was iron. Ethan worked the pry bar along the seam until he uncovered a narrow latch. When he pulled it, something clicked inside the wall. The largest stone shifted inward, then rolled sideways on. Hidden tracks with a low rumble. A passage opened beyond it. Ranger did not enter immediately. He sniffed the air, listened, and looked to Ethan for permission. That small pause moved Ethan more than it should have. The dog was not chasing instinct blindly. Even after everything they had survived, he was still asking to move as a team. Go. They stepped into the corridor together. An old lantern hung from a peg. Beside it, protected beneath waxed paper, was a card written in Eleanor's hand. If you have come this far, Ranger has decided you are ready. Ethan read it aloud. The dog's tail tapped the wall once. The passage widened into a room lined with cedar shelves from floor to ceiling. Leather journals, document boxes, rolled maps, and cloth-wrapped bundles filled every space. An oak desk stood at the center beneath a brass lamp. A quilt rested over the back of a rocking chair. The room felt less abandoned than paused, as if Eleanor had stepped upstairs for tea and expected to return. Labels had been fixed to each shelf. Military letters, family records, property deeds, photographs, Community histories. Ethan walked slowly, afraid that a careless breath might disturb the order around him. The hidden room held no gold, no weapons, and no stacks of cash. Yet someone had spent decades preserving every page as if it were priceless. On the desk stood the photograph he had found in the kitchen, only larger and clearer. Eleanor smiled beside the older man in suspenders. On the back she had written, Eleanor Carter and Samuel Whitaker, Autumn, 1986. Scout refused to look at the camera. Scout was the German shepherd beside Samuel. Ranger approached the photograph, sniffed the frame, then moved toward a tall cedar cabinet in the far corner. Its doors opened without resistance. Inside were journals labeled by year, beginning in 1978 and ending a few months before Eleanor's death. The first page of the oldest journal held two names, Eleanor Carter, Samuel Whitaker. Below them was a sentence, "We keep what others are forced to leave behind until it can safely find its way home." Ethan sat at the desk and began reading. The entries described widows who feared losing service letters during moves, farmers who needed copies of deeds while they fought medical bills, families who left photographs before floods, divorces, and foreclosures scattered their belongings. Eleanor and Samuel accepted each item, copied records by hand, photographed documents, and recorded where every piece belonged. Then Ethan found the clipping about the courthouse fire. 31 years earlier, flames had destroyed much of the county records building. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, military papers, property plats, and decades of local history had vanished before dawn. The official investigation blamed faulty wiring. For hundreds of families, the result was the same. Their connection to the past had become smoke. But Eleanor and Samuel had copies. They spent years returning what they could, one family at a time. The archive was not a collection. It was a promise. Ranger nudged Ethan's elbow, then turned toward the cabinet. A narrow lower drawer bore a brass label. "Start here." Inside lay a leather portfolio tied with blue ribbon and a sealed envelope addressed to whoever opens this room with an honest heart. Ethan recognized Eleanor's handwriting before he broke the wax. "Dear Ethan, if these words have reached you, then I am no longer there to welcome you home. I am sorry for that. But Ranger is with you, which means you are not alone. Samuel believed history survives when ordinary people refuse to let another person's story disappear. We were never owners of what is in this room. We were caretakers. Most of the records have been returned. Some have not. You do not owe the past your life. But if you choose to help, begin with the people, not the papers." A brass key fell from the fold of the letter. It opened a roll-top cabinet filled with hundreds of index cards. Most family names had blue check marks beside them. 11 did not. At the bottom was a smaller envelope marked unfinished. Inside were photographs, copied military discharge papers, letters, and a hand-drawn map. One location near Chesterfield County had been circled twice in red. Harper. Beneath the name, Eleanor had written, "We found the family." We did not. Find what Samuel hid for them. Another note lay below it, written in a firmer hand Ethan assumed belonged to Samuel. "If the red line on the old survey is ever challenged, the valley will need the original witness page. I placed it where Scout would know to wait. Eleanor knows the beginning. Margaret knows the end." Ethan studied the words until they blurred. He had expected a box of memories. Instead, he had found a warning. Tucked behind the note was a recent newspaper clipping, dated 3 months before Eleanor died. A development company called Blue Ridge Renewal had purchased several abandoned claims near Harper Road. Its plan promised jobs, new roads, and a private mountain resort. 11 properties lay within the proposed boundary. The same 11 names without check marks. Ranger placed one paw against Ethan's boot. From somewhere in the wall came the soft wooden knock again. Ethan turned sharply. This time he saw the source. A loose shutter inside a ventilation shaft moved with the morning wind. He let out the breath he had been holding, almost laughing at himself. Yet the relief lasted only a moment. On the desk, beside the 11 names, Eleanor had added one final sentence. "They think the record's burned. They are wrong." Ethan spent the next hour trying to talk himself out of getting involved. The newspaper clipping was old. The development might have stalled. The names could be a coincidence. Eleanor had been sick during her final months, and Samuel's notes sounded like the kind of unfinished concern that grew larger when left alone in a locked room. More importantly, Ethan had problems of his own. The farmhouse taxes were overdue. The roof leaked above the north bedroom. His truck needed brakes. He had $83 in his checking account and no plan beyond making it through the week. He carried the Harper portfolio upstairs anyway. Ranger followed him to the porch and watched as Ethan spread the documents across a small table. There was a property deed dated 1947, several family photographs, letters from a soldier named Daniel Harper, and a picture of Samuel Whitaker standing beside Scout beneath an enormous maple tree. On the back, Eleanor had written, "Scout waited every afternoon until the very end." The most recent address led to a farmhouse on Harper Road. Ethan folded the eviction notice from his pocket and set it beside the portfolio. For months, that paper had controlled every decision he made. Now it looked small next to records people had protected for generations. He drove east before he could change his mind. The route carried him out of the mountains and through towns where old brick storefronts stood beside new gas stations. Ranger rested in the passenger seat with the Harper photograph between his paws. Twice, the dog woke and touched his nose to the glass before settling again. Near noon, Ethan stopped at a county administration building to ask about Blue Ridge renewal. The lobby smelled of floor wax and printer toner. A display near the entrance showed glossy drawings of cabins, a conference center, and a scenic road winding across wooded hills. Mountain Futures Project. Beneath the title, smaller print announced a public land review in 12 days. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. At the records desk, a county clerk named Miriam Cole listened while he explained that he had found old property copies. She was in her 50s, with tired eyes and a careful way of choosing words. "Copies from before the fire are useful historically," she said. "Legally, it depends on how they were made and whether they can be authenticated. What is being reviewed in 12 days? Miriam glanced toward the project display. Blue Ridge Renewal assembled claims from several estates. Some boundary questions remain. The hearing is meant to resolve them. 11 properties? Her expression changed. "Where did you get that number?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Miriam lowered her voice. "Mr. Carter, I am not saying your documents mean nothing. I am saying you should be careful. People in this county have spent years trying to bring work back. The project has supporters. It also has attorneys. Do the families know their property may be affected? Not all of them agree that it is." That was not an answer, and they both knew it. When Ethan turned to leave, Miriam stopped him. "My father worked in the courthouse when it burned," she said. "Samuel Whitaker was deputy records clerk then. If your papers truly came from him, bring me something with his official seal. Without that, the board will call them private copies." Outside, Ranger stood from the shade beside the truck before Ethan reached him. The dog pressed against Ethan's leg. Ethan realized his hands were shaking. Crowded public buildings did that sometimes. Fluorescent lights, hard echoes, doors opening behind him. He closed his eyes and felt Ranger's shoulder hold steady against his knee. "In and out," Ethan whispered, repeating the old breathing count. "We are here." Ranger remained until Ethan's hand settled. The Harper farmhouse stood at the end of a lane lined with ancient oaks. Its broad porch faced fields washed in late afternoon light. An elderly woman opened the screen door as Ethan parked. She saw Ranger and stopped. Her hand rose to her mouth. The German shepherd did not rush her. He stood beside the truck, ears forward, tail moving slowly. The woman descended the steps with tears already gathering in her eyes. "You are not Scout," she said when Ranger approached. "But mercy, you have his eyes." Ranger lowered his head beneath her hand. Ethan introduced himself. At Eleanor Carter's name, the woman closed her eyes and smiled through the tears. "I am Margaret Harper," she said, "and I have been waiting a very long time for someone from that house." They sat on the porch while Ethan opened the portfolio. Margaret recognized every photograph. She named people before turning the pictures over. She laughed at a faded image of her father, Samuel, asleep in a chair while Scout guarded a plate of biscuits. She pressed a letter from her mother to her chest and remained silent for so long that Ethan wondered whether bringing the papers had caused more pain than comfort. Then she reached for Samuel's warning note. Her face lost its color. "He wrote this after the survey dispute," she said. "What red line?" Margaret looked toward the western field, where old fence posts disappeared into trees. In 1962, 11 families created a shared conservation covenant. They agreed that the ridge, the spring, and the old access road could never be sold separately from their farms. Samuel recorded it. The original survey had a witness page with every signature and his seal. And that page is missing. It vanished before the courthouse fire. Samuel believed a land broker had removed it because timber rights on the ridge were worth a fortune. He made copies, but he hid the original witness page somewhere else after someone broke into his office. Where? Margaret looked at Ranger. Father would only say Scout knew where promises waited. Ethan felt frustration rise. That could mean anything. I know. Eleanor knew the first part of the route. Father gave me the last. She went inside and returned with a sealed envelope addressed to the next caretaker. Samuel's letter was brief. If Eleanor sends you, look where the first dog learned to stay. Follow the water that runs uphill. When you reach the tree that survived lightning, Margaret's memory will finish the road. Ethan read it twice. Margaret pointed beyond the fields. Scout was trained at an old veterans camp in the Western Mountains. Eleanor helped there after the war. The camp closed more than 40 years ago. What does water that runs uphill mean? I never knew. A black sport utility vehicle slowed on the road, then turned into the driveway. Margaret's mouth tightened. The man who stepped out wore polished boots and a rain jacket too clean for the dust around him. He introduced himself as Adrian Vale, director of Blue Ridge Renewal. He was younger than Ethan expected, perhaps 40, with an open face and the controlled calm of someone accustomed to rooms turning quiet when he spoke. I heard a carter had come back to Eleanor's place, Adrian said. News travels fast. His eyes moved to the portfolio. Margaret stood between him and the table. Adrian sighed. Mrs. Harper, I am not here to take your home. The project needs an access easement across the back acreage. You would be compensated. The back acreage holds our family cemetery. The route can be adjusted. You said that about the spring. Adrian looked genuinely tired. This county has lost 2 mills, a hospital wing, and half its young people in 15 years. The resort would employ hundreds. I am trying to build something that keeps families here. By erasing the ones already here? Ethan asked. Adrian studied him. You must be Ethan. The use of his first name felt deliberate. I made your grandmother an offer for her farm, Adrian continued. She refused. I would make you the same offer. More than enough to clear the tax debt and start over. Ethan's shame flared before he could hide it. Adrian knew about the taxes. He probably knew about the eviction too. Ranger stepped forward, not growling, simply placing himself between Ethan and the stranger. Adrian looked down at him. Beautiful dog. He is working, Ethan said. Then so am I. Adrian returned his attention to Ethan. Old documents create hope. They also create confusion. Before you promise these families something, make sure you can prove it. He left a business card on the porch rail and drove away. Margaret waited until the vehicle disappeared. He is not wrong about the county, she said quietly. That is what makes him dangerous. He believes the end justifies whatever gets moved out of the way. Ethan picked up the card. The offer could solve every immediate problem he had. Sell the farmhouse. Pay the debt. Leave the mountain with enough money to stop feeling hunted by every bill. Ranger nudged the portfolio toward him with his nose. Ethan looked at Samuel's letter, then at the dog. When do we leave for the camp? Margaret's smile was small but certain. At first light, rain moved into the mountains overnight. By morning, clouds had lowered across the ridges, and the road to the abandoned veterans' camp had become a ribbon of mud between dark trees. Margaret rode in the truck with Samuel's letter protected inside her coat. Ranger stood behind the front seats, bracing himself through each turn. The camp lay beyond a locked forest gate. Ethan parked and continued on foot. What remained of the place was little more than foundations, a collapsed dining hall, and a row of stone chimneys standing among young pines. Margaret moved slowly with a cane, but she refused Ethan's arm until the trail steepened. Father brought wounded men here after Korea, she said. Not for treatment, for quiet. He said some people needed a place where no one expected them to explain themselves. Ethan understood that too well. Ranger moved ahead, stopping often to test the air. At the edge of a clearing, he found a rusted training post with an iron ring near its base. Scratched into the stone were the outlines of 2 dogs. The first dog learned to stay, Ethan said. Margaret nodded. Scout trained here. Beneath the post, Ethan found a metal tube sealed with wax. Inside was a strip of oilcloth and a hand-drawn line following a creek north toward a symbol shaped like an arrow. The rain strengthened. They followed the creek through laurel thickets and over slick rocks. For nearly a mile, the water behaved normally, rushing downhill beside them. Then the stream vanished beneath a shelf of limestone. Ranger climbed the bank and stopped. Above them, a narrow channel emerged from the rock and flowed backward along the slope before dropping into a sinkhole. It looked as though the water were running uphill. Samuel loved riddles too much, Margaret muttered. The oilcloth map led beyond the sinkhole to a ridge scarred by an old lightning strike. A massive oak stood there, split down the center but still alive, green leaves growing from both sides of the blackened trunk. Margaret touched the bark. This is where my memory finishes the road. She pointed east. When I was 10, Father brought me here with Scout. He made me stand beneath this tree and face the sunrise. He said if a good person ever asked where he kept the truth, I should tell them to walk until the bell could no longer be heard. What bell? A faint metal note drifted through the rain. Somewhere below the ridge, wind moved an old camp bell. They followed the sound downhill until it faded behind a rock face. Ranger veered left toward a narrow ravine. His breathing changed. He lifted his nose, circled once, and began digging at a patch of loose earth beneath a fallen beam. Ethan knelt beside him. Easy. Ranger ignored the mud collecting around his paws. He dug until one nail split and a dark mark appeared in the wet soil. Ethan gently pulled him back and used the pry bar. A corner of a metal case emerged. Before Ethan could free it, the hillside shifted. Mud slid beneath Margaret's feet. She fell hard against the slope and began sliding toward the ravine. Ethan lunged, caught her wrist, and dropped to one knee. The ground crumbled under his boot. Ranger barked once. The old dog seized the back of Margaret's coat and pulled uphill while Ethan dragged from the front. For several desperate seconds, all three fought the wet earth. Then Margaret rolled onto stable ground. She lay still, breathing sharply. My ankle, she whispered. Ethan checked it. Swollen, but not bent unnaturally. She could not walk. The rain became a steady roar through the trees. Ethan looked at the half-buried case, then at Margaret. 12 days had become 11. The document might be inches away, but the trail back was 2 miles, and night would arrive early beneath the storm. He covered the case with stones and marked the location on his phone, even though there was no service. We are leaving. Margaret protested. Samuel waited half a century. He can wait one more day? Ethan lifted her onto his back. The words surprised him as soon as he said them. A year earlier, he would have chosen the mission first and trusted people to endure. That was how he had been trained. Complete the objective. Secure the evidence. Return for what remained. But Ranger had taught him a different order. Protect the living. The climb back was slow. Margaret held his shoulders while Ranger moved beside them, limping slightly from his torn nail. Halfway to the camp, thunder cracked so close that Ethan's vision flashed white. The sound became another sound. A blast in a narrow street. Dust. A radio screaming beneath rubble. Ethan's chest locked. The forest vanished. For one terrible moment, he could not feel the ground. Ranger pressed against his leg. Ethan nearly fell under Margaret's weight. The dog stayed there, shoulder firm, amber eyes fixed on him. Name 5 things you see, Margaret said from his back. Ethan forced air into his lungs. Ranger. Your blue coat. The creek. That pine. My left boot. 4 things you feel. Rain. Your hands. Mud. Ranger. The mountain returned. They reached the truck after dark. At a rural clinic, Margaret's ankle was diagnosed as a severe sprain. Ranger's paw was cleaned and wrapped. The veterinarian warned Ethan that the dog's hip showed advanced arthritis. He should not be climbing ravines, she said. Ethan looked through the exam room window. Ranger lay beside Margaret's chair, still watching the door. He does not always agree that he is retired. Then you have to be the one who remembers. That sentence followed Ethan home. He settled Ranger on the army blanket beside the living room stove and sat on the floor with him. Rain tapped the windows. The farmhouse roof leaked into a bucket upstairs. I keep asking you to carry what I cannot, Ethan said. Ranger opened one eye. Ethan rested his forehead against the dog's neck. Beneath the thick fur, the heartbeat was steady but slower than it used to be. I am sorry. Ranger shifted closer until his shoulder touched Ethan's chest. The next morning, Ethan returned to the ravine alone. At least, he tried to. Ranger blocked the truck door with his body. No, the dog held his ground. You are hurt. Ranger looked toward the cellar, then back at Ethan. He walked to the porch and sat. Ethan understood. Ranger was not asking to go. He was reminding Ethan that staying could be an act of loyalty too. I will come back. Ranger lowered himself beside Margaret, who had agreed to wait at the farmhouse. Ethan reached the metal case near noon. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was the original covenant survey, Samuel's embossed deputy seal, and 10 witness signatures. The 11th signature page was missing. A note had been placed where it should have been. The last page went home with the man who feared the truth would be stolen. Find Daniel Harper's final letter. Ethan closed his eyes. Daniel Harper was Margaret's older brother, the soldier whose letters lay in the portfolio. He had died overseas in 1970. The hearing was 10 days away, and the only person who might know where his final letter had gone had been dead for more than 50 years. Margaret received the news without surprise. My brother never trusted offices. After the break-in, she said. Her bandaged ankle rested on a stool in Eleanor's kitchen. He was home on leave when Father discovered the witness page missing. Daniel signed the replacement page and carried it overseas because he believed no one would search a soldier's mail. Did he send it back? He said he would place it in his last letter if things became dangerous. Then his final package arrived without a letter. Ethan opened the Harper portfolio across the table. Every envelope was numbered in Eleanor's handwriting. 1, 2, 3, 5. Number 4 was missing. Ranger, resting on the blanket, lifted his head when Ethan touched the gap. Margaret remembered that Daniel's effects had been sent to a church after his death because their mother was in the hospital and Samuel was away working. The church had closed years ago. Its records were transferred to a small historical society in Richmond. Ethan called. A volunteer promised to search, but warned that unclaimed boxes had been moved repeatedly. Adrian Vale called before the afternoon ended. I hear you found something in the old camp, he said. Ethan glanced toward the window. A dark vehicle was parked far down the gravel road, barely visible through the trees. How did you hear that? Mountain communities talk. The hearing board also received notice that you intend to challenge the access claims. I have not filed anything. Mrs. Harper did. Ethan looked at Margaret. She raised her chin. Adrian continued. I want to be clear. I am not threatening you. But incomplete historical papers will not stop a project approved through years of legal review. If you sell the Carter parcel, I can guarantee the farmhouse stays standing. We could make the archive part of a visitor center. You have never seen the archive. No, but your grandmother mentioned it when she rejected my offer. That landed harder than Ethan expected. She told you. She told me enough. She also said the room would be worthless in the hands of someone who confused possession with care. Adrian sounded almost amused, but there was hurt beneath it. You knew her. Everyone knew Eleanor. Then why are you trying to undo what she protected? Silence held for a moment. Because protecting memories does not keep a school open, Adrian said. It does not create medical jobs. It does not stop another family from leaving because there is no future here. Your grandmother preserved the past. I am trying to preserve the county. The call ended. Ethan wanted Adrian to be cruel. Cruelty would have made the choice easier. Instead, the man's argument followed him through the house. The valley needed jobs. Empty storefronts proved that. Families could not live on history alone. But history should not be used as a blank space for someone else's plan. Over the next 6 days, Ethan and Margaret contacted the remaining families named in Samuel's file. Some had never heard of the covenant. Others remembered grandparents speaking about a shared spring and an agreement that no company could divide the ridge. A mechanic named Luis Ortega brought a cigar box filled with his great-grandfather's receipts. Tucked beneath them was a hand-drawn copy of the western boundary. A schoolteacher named Dana Price found a photograph of the original signing picnic. 11 families stood beneath the Harper maple tree. Samuel held the survey. Daniel, home in uniform, stood beside him. On the back, someone had written, "One land, many keepers." Each piece strengthened the story but not the legal proof. The Historical Society called 2 days before the hearing. They had found Daniel Harper's effects. Ethan and Ranger drove to Richmond before sunrise. Ranger's paw had healed enough for short walks, but Ethan lifted him into the truck instead of letting him jump. The dog gave him an offended look. You can complain after the hearing. The Historical Society occupied an old train depot. A volunteer named June led them into a climate-controlled room and placed a battered footlocker on a table. Daniel Harper's name was stenciled across the lid. Inside were uniforms, photographs, a pocket Bible, and letters tied with twine. Ethan checked every envelope. 1, 2, 3, 5. No 4. Ranger circled the footlocker, nose working. He stopped at the false bottom beneath the folded uniform and scratched lightly. Ethan removed the tray. A narrow compartment held a cassette tape, a brass dog whistle, and a letter addressed to Samuel. The envelope was number 4. Margaret joined them by video call as Ethan opened it with gloved hands. "Father, I kept the sign page as you asked. I could not risk mailing it after your office was entered. Scout knows the place where we practiced the long stay. Put the whistle to the east window at sunset, and he will show you. If I do not come home, tell Margaret I was never afraid of being forgotten. I was afraid she would think I chose not to return." The witness page was not in the envelope, but the cassette tape held Daniel's voice. The recording crackled before a young man began speaking about home, the maple tree, and Scout waiting beside the porch. Near the end, Daniel gave a command. "Scout, long stay. East window." Ranger stood abruptly. The dog stared toward the depot's east-facing windows, then at the brass whistle on the table. Ethan felt the pieces align. Scout had not hidden the page at the veterans' camp. Daniel had trained him to return to a location connected to an east window at sunset. The photograph in the archive showed Scout beside Samuel and Eleanor at the Carter farmhouse. Eleanor's kitchen had an east window. They drove back through heavy afternoon traffic while storm clouds gathered over the mountains. The public hearing began at 9 the next morning. At sunset, Ethan stood outside Eleanor's kitchen with Daniel's whistle. He blew once. The sound was thin and clear. Ranger's ears rose. He moved along the eastern wall, past the rain barrel, toward the orchard. He stopped at an old stone well Ethan had assumed was dry. Carved into the rim was the oak tree and star. Ranger looked down. The well was shallow, filled halfway with leaves. Ethan climbed in with a rope around his waist while Margaret held the other end from above. Near the eastern stones, his fingers found a metal ring. A cedar box slid from a hidden recess. Inside was Scout's first collar, Samuel's seal book, and the missing witness page. All 11 signatures remained clear. For one breathless moment, Ethan felt victory. Then Ranger barked toward the house. Smoke curled from the cellar doors. Ethan dropped the box into Margaret's hands and ran. An overloaded wire near the old furnace had sparked inside the basement. Flames climbed the dry shelving where Ethan had moved the mason jars. Smoke rolled across the ceiling, cutting off the hidden stone door. Ranger rushed toward the stairs. Ethan caught his collar. "No, stay with Margaret." The dog fought him, not from panic, but purpose. He could smell what Ethan could not. From behind the stone wall came a faint alarm tone. Someone was inside the archive. Ethan opened the cellar doors wider and crawled beneath the smoke. Near the hidden passage, he found Miriam Cole on the floor, coughing, one hand wrapped around a canvas records bag. She had come to authenticate Samuel's seal before the hearing. The fire had started while she was inside. Ethan dragged her toward the stairs, but a burning shelf collapsed across the path. Ranger appeared through the smoke. He had slipped free from Margaret. The old K9 moved low, found a narrow opening beside the furnace, and barked once. Ethan followed. Together they pulled Miriam through the gap as flames licked across the ceiling. At the stairs, Ranger stumbled. Ethan lifted him into both arms. The metal case, the seal, and every legal document were outside. But thousands of family records remained behind the stone wall. Ethan looked back. Then he remembered the ravine. Protect the living. He carried Ranger out. Neighbors saw the smoke and arrived within minutes. Luis Ortega brought extinguishers from his garage. The volunteer fire department reached the farm before the flames entered the hidden archive. Water damaged part of the basement, but the stone passage and cedar room survived. Adrian Vale arrived behind the fire trucks. He stared at Miriam wrapped in a blanket, at Ranger breathing beneath an oxygen mask, and at the wet witness page protected inside Margaret's coat. For the first time, his calm expression broke. "This is because of the project?" Ethan demanded. "No," Adrian shook his head. "I sent no one here." Miriam looked up. He did not. "I came alone. I found a note in my father's old files. He helped Samuel make the seal copies after the courthouse fire. He spent the rest of his life afraid people would think he had destroyed evidence." She held out the canvas bag. Inside were her father's sworn statement and the county's original index number for the covenant. The chain of authentication was complete. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Then he looked toward the farmhouse and said, "The hearing changes tomorrow." The county hearing room was full before 9. Families from the 11 properties filled one side. Contractors, business owners, and supporters of Mountain Futures filled the other. Some people had come because they feared losing land. Others came because they feared losing the only major investment the county had seen in years. Ethan sat near the front with Ranger at his feet. The veterinarian had cleared the dog after a night of observation, but smoke had irritated his lungs, and exhaustion showed in the way his head rested against Ethan's boot. Ethan kept one hand on his shoulder. Margaret carried the original witness page. Miriam carried her father's statement and Samuel's seal registry. The documents had been dried, protected, and copied before sunrise. Adrian Vale entered without his usual folder of presentation materials. When the board chair asked him to begin, he stood at the lectern and faced the room. Blue Ridge Renewal built its plan on deeds and boundary records certified after the courthouse fire, he said. This morning, new evidence established that those records omitted a valid conservation covenant. Continuing under the current plan would violate that covenant and the trust of the families who signed it. A murmur spread across the room. One of Adrian's attorneys leaned toward him, but he raised a hand. "I am withdrawing the access claim." Several supporters reacted angrily. A restaurant owner stood and demanded to know what would replace the jobs Adrian had promised. A young father asked whether history mattered more than keeping his children in the county. Adrian listened. Then he looked at Ethan. "That is the question we should have asked before drawing a road through a cemetery and a spring," he said. "Not whether the past matters more than the future. Whether we are capable of building a future that does not require pretending the past is empty." He proposed moving the resort project to land the company already owned east of the ridge, reducing its size, and partnering with the county on restoration tourism, veterans programs, and an archive center at the Carter farm if Ethan and the families agreed. It was not a perfect answer. Funding would have to change. Jobs would take longer. Some investors might leave. But for the first time, no one in the room was being asked to disappear for the plan to work. Miriam authenticated Samuel's seal. Margaret read the 11 family names aloud. One by one, descendants stood. The board voted unanimously to recognize the covenant. Ethan expected relief to feel larger. Instead, it arrived quietly, like the pressure of Ranger's head against his knee. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Margaret and Adrian. Ethan slipped away to the shade of an oak tree. Ranger followed 3 steps, then stopped. His back legs trembled. Ethan knelt immediately. The dog tried once more, but his right hip gave way. Ethan caught him before he hit the ground. The veterinarian later explained that the strain, smoke, and years of service had accelerated what was already happening. Ranger would still walk, but not far. Stairs would become difficult. Search work was over. Ethan sat beside him in the clinic until evening. "You found the room," he whispered. "You found Margaret. You found Daniel's letter. You found Miriam in the smoke." Ranger watched him. "You do not have to find anything else." The dog placed one paw over Ethan's hand. That was how the next chapter began. The families repaired the farmhouse together. Luis rewired the basement. Dana's students cataloged photographs under careful supervision. Margaret identified faces and recorded stories in a voice that grew stronger each week. Miriam created certified digital copies while preserving the originals exactly where Eleanor and Samuel had placed them. Adrian kept his promise. Blue Ridge Renewal donated fireproof cabinets, helped restore the old veterans camp, and redesigned the project beyond the protected ridge. Some people never forgave. How close the first plan came to erasing their land. Adrian did not ask them to. He showed up, listened, and accepted that trust would return more slowly than construction permits. Ethan refused to sell the farm. He also refused to turn the archive into a private attraction. With the families, he created the Carter-Whitaker Community Trust. The farmhouse remained a home, but the archive belonged to every family whose story rested beneath it. The first family day at the restored farm tested that belief. More than 60 people arrived carrying albums, service ribbons, recipes, and names written on scraps of paper. Ethan felt the old pressure rise as voices filled every room. He began counting exits without meaning to. Ranger noticed before anyone else. The dog left his bed, crossed the crowded porch, and placed himself against Ethan's leg. A little boy named Caleb saw the movement and quietly sat on Ranger's other side. He did not ask why Ethan had gone silent. He simply showed him a photograph of his great-grandmother standing beside Eleanor at a church picnic. "Mom says you saved her," Caleb said. Ethan looked at the photograph, then at the families sharing stories beneath the trees. "No," he answered. "A lot of people saved a place for her memory. I just opened the door." Caleb considered that, then scratched Ranger gently behind one ear. The pressure in Ethan's chest eased. The archive was no longer a secret he had to defend alone. It had become a circle of people choosing, again and again, to make room for one another. A year after the fire, a simple stone marker was placed beside the cellar doors. Preserved through kindness. Shared through love. Remembered together. Below the words were the names Eleanor Carter and Samuel Whitaker. Ranger sat beside the marker for the dedication. He could no longer manage the cellar steps, so Ethan had built a gentle ramp along the outside foundation. The old dog descended it slowly, pausing at each turn while children waited without rushing him. When he reached the hidden room, he went directly to the oak desk and lay beneath it as if reporting for duty. Ethan watched from the doorway. He remembered arriving with an eviction notice, convinced that needing help made him weak. Yet everything around him existed because people had carried one another when pride, grief, fire, distance, or time became too heavy. Samuel had carried the records. Eleanor had carried the promise. Margaret had carried the final memory. Miriam had carried her father's truth. And Ranger had carried Ethan. The realization changed the way he spoke to veterans who began visiting the farm. Some came to share letters. Some came because the restored camp offered quiet weekends and trained support dogs. Some arrived with the same guarded eyes Ethan had worn when he first stepped onto the porch. He never told them to be grateful. He never told them healing was easy. He gave them coffee, introduced them to Ranger, and let the house remain quiet until they were ready. One autumn evening, exactly 2 years after Ethan lost his apartment, he sat on the porch beneath the old wind chime. The mountains had turned copper and gold. Ranger rested on a padded bed beside his chair, breathing slowly. A pickup stopped at the gate. A teenage girl approached carrying a small box. Her family had received letters from the archive months earlier. Now she wanted to leave copies of her grandfather's recorded stories for children who had not been born yet. Ethan opened the door for her. Before he followed, Ranger lifted his head. His eyes moved toward the cellar, then back to Ethan. The same look. Patient. Certain. But this time there was no urgent mystery waiting below. Only shelves cared for by many hands and a light that no longer depended on one person to keep burning. Ethan crouched beside him. "You were right," he said. Home was waiting. Ranger leaned into his hand. Later, after the girl's recording had been labeled and placed beside her family's letters, Ethan opened Eleanor's final journal. Beneath her last entry, he wrote one sentence. "The promise continues, and no one carries it alone." He closed the book and turned off the brass lamp. Ranger waited at the bottom of the ramp. Ethan walked beside him at the dog's pace, one slow step at a time. Outside, families were laughing around a long table beneath the oak trees. Margaret waved from the porch. The wind chime answered the evening breeze. Ethan looked back once at the cellar doors. He had believed his grandmother left him a ruined farmhouse because she had nothing else to give. In truth, she had left him a place where loss could become service, where strangers could become neighbors, and where a man who thought his usefulness had ended could learn that purpose was not something awarded by a uniform or measured by a paycheck. Sometimes it began with stopping long enough to listen. Sometimes it waited behind a forgotten wall. And sometimes it came on 4 aging paws, with patient eyes and a loyalty strong enough to lead a lost man all the way home. If this journey stayed with you, share what loyalty means in your life, and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe for more stories about courageous K9s and the people whose lives they change. Somewhere, another forgotten promise may still be waiting for an honest heart to find it.